We always hear about the glories and successes of us agents when we list and sell a property for a client or when we help a buyer get into their dream home. But what we don't like to talk about is when that deal goes sideways. Well, I'm going to put an end to that today because discussing how a deal can fall apart and fall apart legally, because that is a huge portion of my job selling real estate. Sure, the fancy suits and luxurious listings are fun, but what we get paid to do is actually less glamorous, and that is to make sure ourselves and our clients don't get sued during their transaction. But before I begin, I'm going to have to ask you to hit that like button. Yes, clicking that like button is all I ask for in exchange for this free information. And this means that if you hit that like button, YouTube will push this video out to more people, and you'll be helping someone you don't even know stay out of real estate jail. So in essence, you're actually fighting for the freedoms of all humanity, or at least that's what I'm going to say to others when they ask about you. Okay, so you want to buy a house and put in a conditional offer on financing, inspection, or any other condition you would like to insert, or that your real estate professional advises you to put into the contract, and that offer gets accepted. But you find out during the home inspection that the house has some major issues that are too much for you to overcome, and you just decide to walk away. Or maybe there was a glitch in your financing and it turns out you don't actually qualify for the property, or maybe the property doesn't appraise at the value of which you have offered. As a result of one of these situations, or a million possible situations that could happen, you no longer have the ability or the interest to continue with the property that you've offered on. Well, at this point in my marketplace of Surrey, BC, you have two options. I'm pretty sure everywhere you go, they're going to be very similar to this. Option one, wait until the expiry of your conditions. This means that if you negotiated a subject removal of, let's say, July 1st, and you don't remove those conditions by 11:59 p.m. on the day, that when the clock ticks over to midnight the morning of July 2nd, you nor the seller have any further obligation to the contract. It is essentially dead because the terms within the contract say that time is of the essence. That means certain things have to be done at certain times, and if they're not, the contract is null and void. Option two, however, is the right option, or at least here in BC, where the BCREA has provided a form to formally release all parties from the contract, called the General Release and Authorization to Pay Deposit Funds form. Execution of this form is indeed the correct way to release a contract to make sure that you, as the seller or the buyer, and their realtors for that matter, don't end up in a bad situation. Just to be clear, yes, option one, if not done correctly, has a very real possibility of you ending up fighting for the house, fighting to sell to someone else, or even fighting for the deposit. So let's start with the form and clarify a few things. Section 1 and 2 of the form actually release the buyer and seller from each other, and they actually release their respective agents and brokerages. But section 3 is where the protection sets in and acknowledges if any deposits were paid or not. And if deposits were paid, who would they be released to and released by? Now, this is where your area may vary, and you should consult your own real estate professional. BC Standard Contract of Purchase and Sale provides the deposit to be paid within 24 hours of acceptance. However, in my marketplace of Surrey, BC and Vancouver, the deposit is not usually paid until conditions are removed and the deal goes firm. This means that subjects or conditions have been completely withdrawn from the contract and the deal is binding. So this is the point where I point out that it is rare that deposits are in the mix when the general release form is being used to collapse an offer. So hopefully in 90% or more of the situations, that no deposit was paid box should be checked off, and then the buyer and seller can go on their merry ways. However, if a deposit was paid on acceptance rather than when the deal goes firm, now we have to decide who gets the deposit. And this is why there is section 4 in the form called legal advice. Yes, this is the spot where you should speak to a lawyer about if you or the other party are entitled to that deposit. And this is usually determined in the contract itself. But it's not as simple as each party thinks. You see, most of the time, the buyer in the deal thinks, well, hey, I didn't firm up the deal, therefore I get my deposit back. And the seller thinks the exact opposite. A deal's a deal, and you're not getting your deposit money back. I mean, really, the seller considers it non-refundable. And now we can see why it is you should talk to a lawyer. It's important to point out that if you ever do get to this point, your real estate agent should actually back down and advise you to get legal advice. They should then rely on the opinion of your counsel to help them proceed. But there's another possibility. What if the deal is firm and the property was actually registered as sold? Well, this doesn't often happen, but this is what we call in the industry collapsing a sale. And to be frank, if you get this far, there's a very good chance you're thinking about suing someone, or someone is thinking about suing you. But if you and the buyer want to avoid the legal proceedings because you and your respective lawyers don't think it's worth the battle, then this general release form is not only an option to terminate the contract and move on, but it's actually required. Now, I will say, and I'm not a lawyer, if you get to the point on a firm sale with deposit paid and you are the buyer, you will have way less of a shot of retrieving the deposit, and it will likely be forfeited to the seller, but not always. Now, let me get into something that you might not even have considered and an example of why this form is so important and powerful. Let's say you're the seller and you accept an offer on your property from buyer A. Buyer A then phones the next day and says, sorry, something changed, but there is no way I can afford this property. So buyer A is walking away. But buyer A still has 7 days of conditions, and they either refuse or neglect to sign this release. So it's 2 days later and buyer B comes along with a no condition offer over the asking price and pays you the deposit. You have now sold to buyer B, and you have sold to buyer B for more money. So both you and buyer B are extremely happy. But what happens if buyer A comes back at 11:58 p.m. on the 7th day of conditions and actually removes his or her conditions and also pays the deposit? Well, now you have successfully sold your property to 2 separate parties, and you've probably also successfully walked your way into at least 1, if not 2 lawsuits. What? Why? Because the transaction with buyer A was never canceled in writing. This is not, however, the only way that this can go sideways. This is only one example. So if you would like to discuss this any further, maybe reach out in the comments or book a time to chat with me. So the moral of the story is this: it's never legal until you put it in writing. Make sure if you are not proceeding with a property, or if you are the seller and the buyer is not proceeding with the property, that you put it on paper. And the right way to put it on paper is by using the BCREA's General Release and Authorization to Pay Deposit Fund form. Thanks for watching. If you learned anything today, hit that like button. That like button means I learned something today, so make sure you press that. If you want to stay up to date on the market, hit subscribe. It really helps the channel and we appreciate it. And also hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single update.